A woman saw a boy begging for money at the mall. When she saw the boy's necklace, she froze, recognizing it. The usual bustle of the New Horizon shopping mall filled Sophia's ears as she walked among the shops, carefully observing every person who passed by. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and the place was packed with people doing their shopping, enjoying the pleasant temperature and the lively atmosphere. Sophia stopped in front of one of the main entrances, her gaze sweeping attentively over every corner of the huge building. It had been a little over a decade since she last visited this mall, but despite the passage of time, it was familiar. She remembered coming here with her parents when she was a child, enjoying shopping trips and eating ice cream on the terrace while watching the people come and go. A lump formed in her throat as she thought about those memories. She slowly raised her hand and wiped away a tear that had started to slide down her cheek. So many years had passed since she had last been in this place, and so much had changed in her life since then. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. She couldn't let memories overwhelm her now. She had to stay calm and focus on what she'd come to do. She started walking again, leaving the entrance behind and entering the bustling mall. Her eyes scanned each of the faces that crossed her path, desperately searching for something, or rather someone in particular. Sophia had spent the last few months following a lead that had brought her back to this place. After so many years of fruitless searching, she had finally found new hope, a small light at the end of a dark tunnel that had tormented her for too long. She made her way through the crowd, avoiding bumping into other shoppers and keeping her eyes fixed on her target. She couldn't afford to be distracted, not now that she was so close. She had to concentrate and not lose sight of the boy who, according to the information she'd managed to gather, would be hanging around somewhere in this huge mall. As she walked on, her eyes scrutinized every corner, every group of people, every face that crossed her path. She had to find him. It had to be today. After so many years of waiting and frustration, this was her last chance. Suddenly, her gaze landed on a small figure, a thin, hunched silhouette sitting on the ground near one of the busiest stores. She approached cautiously, her eyes fixed on the boy who seemed to be begging for money from passersby. Sophia felt her heart pounding in her chest as she got closer. She could clearly see the boy's face now, his features distorted by the shadows and dirt. He had messy hair and a look of deep sadness in his eyes. But despite that, something about his face seemed terribly familiar to her. When she was close enough, her eyes stopped at the object the boy wore around his neck, a small silver cross pendant, the same one she had seen in countless photographs over the years. Sophia stopped short, feeling as if she couldn't breathe. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. That necklace, that small, simple necklace that had belonged to her son, the same one that had disappeared along with him so many years ago, was now hanging from the neck of this street child. For several seconds, Sophia stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the boy, her mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation for what she was seeing. Could it be possible? Could this really be her son, the same boy who had disappeared without a trace over a decade ago? She felt as if her heart would burst out of her chest, emotion and hope mingling with fear and uncertainty. Slowly, Sophia approached the boy, her gaze fixed on the necklace hanging around his neck. She had to be sure. She had to confirm what her eyes were showing her. If it was true, if this boy was really her son, everything would change. After so many years of suffering and despair, she would finally be able to find him and bring him home. She stopped in front of him, carefully observing each of his features, searching for some sign that would confirm the terrible suspicion gripping her heart. The boy looked up at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and hope. Where did you get that necklace?" Sophia asked, her voice barely a trembling whisper. The boy looked at her suspiciously, shrugging his shoulders. "I've had it since I was born," he replied in a low, almost inaudible voice. Sophia felt the world around her vanish as the boy's words echoed in her mind. It can't be true. It simply can't be true. That necklace, that small silver pendant, had been a special gift when her son was baptized. She remembered it with painful clarity. Her eyes filled with tears, and she had to make a superhuman effort to maintain her composure. Slowly, she knelt down in front of the boy, her hands trembling as she reached out to him. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "My name is Andres," the boy replied, eyeing her cautiously. Sophia felt her heart skip a beat. That was the name they'd given their son when he was born. It couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't be. How old are you, Andres?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm 11 years old," the boy replied, his gaze steady. Sophia felt tears starting to slide down her cheeks. 11 years old, the same age her son would be if he were alive. She couldn't believe what was happening. It was too much to process. "Where are you from, Andres?" she asked, moving a little closer to the boy. "I don't know," Andres replied, looking down. I remember living in an orphanage when I was younger, but I don't know anything else. I've never met my parents." Sophia felt the world around her crumble. This boy, this Andres who was in front of her, was her son. There was no doubt. That necklace, that name, that age, everything fit perfectly. Unable to hold back any longer, Sophia reached out and wrapped the boy in a tight embrace, sobbing uncontrollably. Andres stood motionless, surprised by the woman's reaction. It's you?" Sophia whispered, stroking the boy's messy hair. "You're my son, my Andres. After all this time." Andres froze, unsure how to react. Never before had anyone hugged him like that, with such emotion and desperation. He could feel the woman's tears soaking his shoulder as she held him tight. What's going on?" he murmured, confused. Sophia pulled away slightly, taking the boy's face in her hands and looking into his eyes. You are my son," she said, her voice breaking. "You're my Andres, the boy who disappeared over 11 years ago. It's you, my love. You've come back to me." Andres stared at her, stunned, at a loss for words. How could this woman be hugging him like this, claiming he was her son? He had never had a family before. He'd always lived in the orphanage or on the streets, alone and abandoned. I don't understand," he stammered, drawing back slightly. There must be a mistake. I'm not your son. I don't have a family." Sophia shook her head, her hands still holding the boy's face. "No, Andres, you are my son. Look." She pointed to the necklace hanging around his neck. This necklace. We gave it to you when you were baptized. It's yours. I put it on you myself when you were a baby. It's you, my love. It's my Andres." Andres looked at her, stunned, not knowing what to say. Never before had anyone spoken to him like that, with such emotion and affection. And that necklace, he had always worn it, for as long as he could remember. But how could this woman know him? Slowly, Andres raised a hand and touched the silver pendant hanging around his neck, observing it carefully. He had never paid much attention to it before. It was just an object that had always been there, a part of him. But now, as he looked at it, something inside him seemed to awaken. I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice trembling. "I've never had a family. I've always been alone. I don't understand what's happening." Sophia looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the confusion and fear reflected in the boy's eyes, and it broke her heart. Gently, she reached out and caressed Andres's cheek, wiping away a tear that was sliding down his dirty face. "Shh, it's okay, my love," she whispered soothingly. "Everything is going to be all right. You're safe now. I'm your mother, Andres. I've been looking for you all these years, and I've finally found you." Andres looked at her, unsure what to say. Could this woman, this stranger who had hugged him so emotionally, really be his mother? How was that possible? He'd never had a family before. He had always lived alone and abandoned. But that necklace, that small silver pendant hanging around his neck, it was real. And the way this woman had recognized it told him that there was some truth in her words. Maybe, just maybe, she really was his mother. Slowly, Andres reached out and touched Sophia's face, his fingers tracing her features gently. He could see hope and love reflected in her eyes, and something within him began to awaken. Are you really my mother?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sophia nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. Yes, my love, she replied, her voice trembling. I'm your mother, and I've been looking for you all these years. I I never gave up. And now I've finally found you. Andres looked at her, not knowing what to say. He felt as if his world had been turned upside down in a matter of seconds. All his life he'd been alone, knowing nothing about his past or his family. And now this woman appeared out of nowhere, claiming to be his mother. Slowly, Andres moved closer to Sophia and hugged her, letting the tears flow freely down his face. Shh, my love, you're safe now, she said, her voice thick with tears. I'm here, and I'll never let you go again. You're my Andres, my lost boy. Andres clung to her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt anything like this before. Such a deep, warm connection with another person. And now this woman who claimed to be his mother was holding him with such tenderness and desperation, as if she'd been waiting for this moment for an eternity. They stayed like that, embraced in the middle of the bustling mall, while Sophia wept with emotion and Andres clung to her, feeling safe and loved for the first time in his life. Finally, Sophia pulled away slightly and took Andres' face in her hands, gazing at him with a radiant smile through her tears. My boy, my precious Andres, she said softly, I can't believe I found you after all this time. I never gave up. And now you're here, with me. Andres looked at her, speechless. He still found it hard to believe that this woman was really his mother, that everything she was telling him was true. But that connection he felt, the feeling of warmth and security that enveloped him when he was close to her, told him that maybe, just maybe, it was true. I don't know what to say, he murmured, his voice trembling. I've never had a family. I've always been alone. And now you show up and say you're my mother. It's too much to process. Sophia took a deep breath, trying to control her emotions. She knew Andres must be utterly bewildered and confused by everything that was happening. Look, she said, her voice soft. I know this must be very confusing and overwhelming for you, but I want you to know that everything I've told you is true. You are my son, Andres, the boy who disappeared over 11 years ago. It's you, my love. It's my Andres. Andres looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and wariness. But how can that be? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I don't have a family. I've always been alone. I never knew my parents. Sophia nodded sadly, understanding how difficult it must be for him to accept this new reality. I know, my love. I know, she said, squeezing his hand gently. You were kidnapped when you were a baby. You were taken away from me, from your father. And for all these years we've been searching for you, without rest. Andres stared at her, his eyes wide. Kidnapped? He repeated in shock. You mean someone stole me from my parents? Sophia nodded, tears running down her cheeks. Yes, my love, she replied, her voice trembling. You were kidnapped when you were just a few months old. It was one of the worst nights of our lives. Your father and I, we were devastated, and we've spent all these years searching for you, without rest. Andres fell silent, processing all this information that seemed straight out of a movie. How could it be that he had been kidnapped as a baby, that this woman was really his mother? It was too much to comprehend. But how did you find me? He asked, his voice barely audible. How did you know I was your son? Sophia smiled, squeezing his hand gently. It was the necklace, she replied. Andres nodded, pointing to the silver pendant hanging from his neck. This necklace? It was a gift we gave you when you were baptized. I put it on you myself, and I knew right away it was you when I saw it. Andres stared at it, touching the little pendant reverently. He had always worn it, but he'd never paid much attention to it before. Now, however, it seemed to hold a completely different meaning. So you're my mother? He asked, looking at her with disbelief. Sophia nodded, a radiant smile illuminating her face. Yes, my love, I'm your mother, she replied, pulling him close and hugging him tightly. I've been looking for you for all these years and now I've finally found you. Andres let himself be enveloped by the embrace, feeling a warmth and security he had never experienced before. It was as if a part of him, a part he hadn't even known was missing, had been put back in its place. Sophia held him tightly, stroking his hair and whispering words of comfort. It's all right, my love. You're safe now. I'll never let you go again. You're my son, my Andres, and I'm going to take care of you from now on. Andres clung to her, feeling tears sliding down his cheeks. He had never experienced anything like this before. That feeling of belonging, of being loved unconditionally. It was overwhelming, but at the same time, comforting. What's going to happen now? He asked quietly, gazing at her with a touch of fear. Sophia smiled at him, wiping away the tears from his face. Now, we're going home, she replied, her voice soft. I'm going to take you with me, to your real home. We're going to be together again, like it should have always been. Andres looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and wariness. Really? He asked, his voice trembling. I can go with you? Sophia nodded, kissing his forehead tenderly. Of course, my love, she replied, her voice full of conviction. You're my son, and I'm not going to leave you alone for another minute. We're going to be together, as a family. Andres looked at her, feeling hope and joy welling up inside him. After so many years of loneliness and uncertainty, he had finally found his mother. Unable to hold back any longer, Andres threw his arms around Sophia, hugging her tightly as tears ran down his cheeks. Sophia held him close, gently rocking his body and whispering words of comfort and love. It's all right, my love. You're safe now, she murmured, her voice soft. I'll never let you go again. You're my son, and we're going to be together forever. Andres clung to her, feeling the weight of all those years of loneliness and abandonment slowly fading. For the first time in his life, he felt safe, loved, and accompanied. He had a mother, a family, and that was something he'd never even dreamed of. They stayed embraced for several minutes amidst the bustle of the mall, while Sophia wept with emotion and Andres let himself be enveloped by the warmth and love he had so longed for. Finally, Sophia pulled away slightly and took Andres' face in her hands, looking at him with a radiant smile. Let's go home, my love, she said, her voice soft. I have so much to tell you, so many stories to share with you, and you need to meet your father. He's going to be so happy to see you, Andres. We all will. Andres looked at her, feeling almost dizzy from everything that was happening. His father? He would have a father too? It was too much to process, but at the same time, he was excited and curious to meet that part of his family that had been taken from him. My father? He asked, his voice trembling. What's he like? Sophia smiled at him, caressing his cheek tenderly. He's a wonderful man, Andres, she replied, her voice filled with pride. A kind, strong man who has loved you from the very first moment he held you in his arms. He has suffered so much because of your absence. But he never gave up. He's been searching for you all this time too. Andres looked at her, feeling emotion swelling in his heart. After so many years of loneliness, of not knowing anything about his origins, now he had a mother and a father who had been searching tirelessly for him. I want to meet him, he said, his voice breaking. I want to meet my father. Sophia nodded, kissing his forehead tenderly. You will, my love, she replied, her voice full of conviction. We're going to go home now and I'll introduce you to your father. He'll be so happy to see you, Andres. We all will. Andres gave her a small smile, feeling hope and joy filling his heart. After so many years of walking alone in this world, he had finally found his home, his family. Sophia gently led Andres away, her hand intertwined with the boys, as they walked together down the streets towards her home. She could feel how the little boy stayed close to her side, as if afraid that she might disappear at any moment. Emotion and disbelief were etched on his face, and Sophia couldn't stop looking at him, marveling at finally having him by her side. Andres walked in silence, his eyes curiously scanning every corner of the neighborhood they were passing through. It was such a different environment from the slums and the cold, hostile streets he was used to. Here the houses seemed cozy, people walked calmly and smiled, and everything felt safer and warmer. Sophia noticed the tension in the boy's shoulders, the wariness with which he observed everything around him. She understood that for him, all this must be completely overwhelming and strange. After spending so many years alone, without a home or family, to suddenly find himself in such a pleasant environment, surrounded by affection, must be a disconcerting experience. She squeezed his hand gently, drawing his attention. "We're almost home, my love," she said softly. "You're safe now. Nothing bad is going to happen to you." Andres looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and hope. "Really?" he asked quietly. You're not going to leave me alone again?" Sophia stopped walking and crouched down to be at the boy's level, taking his face in her hands with infinite tenderness. "Listen to me carefully, Andres," she said firmly. "You're never going to be alone again. You're my son, and from now on, we're going to be together forever. Nothing and no one will ever be able to separate us again." Andres looked at her with teary eyes, nodding slightly. Sophia smiled and pulled him towards her, wrapping him in a warm embrace. She could feel the boy's small body trembling slightly, and she swore to herself that she would do everything in her power to erase the fear and loneliness that had tormented him for so many years. After a few moments, they resumed their walk, Andres firmly glued to her side. Sophia gently guided him, proudly pointing to the house they were approaching, a cozy two-story residence with a small front garden. That's our house, Andres," she said, unable to hide the emotion in her voice. "It's your home, the place you've come back to after all this time." Andres looked at the house with a mixture of wonder and caution. It was so different from the cold, dilapidated shelters where he'd spent most of his life. A feeling of warmth and belonging washed over him, but at the same time, he couldn't quite believe that this could really be his home. Sophia seemed to sense his insecurity, for she squeezed his hand gently. "Come on, my love," she urged him, moving toward the door. "There's someone who's anxious to meet you." Andre swallowed nervously but let himself be guided docilely by the woman. When Sophia opened the door, the boy paused on the threshold, cautiously observing the warm and welcoming interior of the house. "I'm home," Sophia announced loudly, without releasing Andres's hand. Almost immediately, a tall, stocky man appeared in the hall, his face reflecting a mixture of surprise and emotion at the sight of the woman. "Sophia!" he exclaimed, hurrying towards her. "What happened? Are you all right?" Sophia smiled at him, her eyes shining with tears, and pulled him into a tight embrace. "I'm fine, my love," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "More than fine. Look." She released Andres's hand and stepped back slightly, gesturing toward the boy, who was standing there, watching the scene with wary eyes. The man who Andres assumed was his father froze, his eyes wide as he gazed at the little boy. A moment later, Andres saw the man's face transform, reflecting a mixture of disbelief, hope, and wonder. "Andres!" he murmured, taking a few shaky steps towards the boy. Andres shrank back slightly, feeling the man's intense gaze fixed on him. He had never seen anyone look at him like that before, with so much emotion and affection. Sophia came over to the boy and took his hand, smiling at him tenderly. "Yes, my love," she said, looking at the man with shining eyes. "It's him. It's our Andres. I found him." The man stepped forward again, his eyes scanning the boy's face with a look of reverence and adoration. Slowly, he reached out a hand and gently placed it on Andres's cheek, as if he were afraid the boy would vanish. "My son," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "My little Andres." Andres stood motionless, feeling the warmth of the man's hand on his face. His eyes scanned the adult's features, searching for a connection, something that would tell him that this man really was his father. Sophia watched the scene with a radiant smile, tears of happiness sliding down her cheeks. After so many years of uncertainty and suffering, seeing her husband and son reunited in this way filled her soul with an indescribable joy. Slowly, the man spread his arms and enveloped Andres in a warm, protective embrace. The boy stiffened for a moment, but little by little, he relaxed, letting himself be enveloped by this display of affection, which was so unfamiliar to him. "My son," the man repeated, stroking Andres's messy hair. Thank God you're home. Andres felt a lump forming in his throat, his eyes burning with unshed tears. He had never experienced anything like this before. That feeling of being welcomed and loved unconditionally. It was overwhelming, but at the same time, comforting and liberating. Slowly, he raised his small arms and returned the embrace, clinging tightly to the man's warm figure. He buried his face in the man's chest, letting the tears flow freely down his cheeks. Sophia watched them, her heart overflowing with emotion, feeling grateful and blessed by this miraculous reunion. Seeing them like that, embraced and connected, told her that Andres was finally where he belonged, in the arms of his parents. After a few moments, the man pulled back slightly and took Andrea's face in his hands, gazing at him with a radiant smile through his tears. "Look at you, son," he said, his voice full of affection. "You're so big, so handsome. I can't believe you're here with me." Andres looked at him, feeling overwhelmed by the intensity of emotion he sensed in the man. Never before had anyone looked at him like that, with such love and adoration. It was a strange feeling, but at the same time, warm and comforting. I can't believe it either," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. All, all this, it seems like a dream." The man smiled at him, his eyes shining with happiness. "Well, believe it, my son," he said, his voice firm. "You're home. With me, with your mother. You'll never be alone again." Andres looked at him, feeling hope and joy slowly taking hold of him. For so many years, he'd lived in loneliness and uncertainty, knowing nothing of his past or family. And now, out of nowhere, he found himself surrounded by two people who loved him and claimed him as their own. It was too much to process, but a part of him wanted to believe that this was real, that he had finally found a home and family. That was something he had never dreamed of, and the prospect of having a different life, a life filled with love and security, was almost overwhelming. Sophia came over and placed a hand on Andres's shoulder, looking at him tenderly. "Come on, my love," she said softly. "I'll show you your room. I'm sure you'll love it." Andres looked at her, nodding shyly. He felt his father's hand on his back, gently guiding him into the house. As they walked, Andres observed everything around him with a mixture of fascination and caution. It was so different from the places where he'd spent most of his life. The walls were decorated with photographs and paintings. The furniture was warm and inviting, and everything radiated a feeling of home and belonging that he had never experienced before. Finally, Sophia stopped in front of a door and opened it, inviting him to enter. Andres hesitated for a moment, but the warm smiles of his parents gave him enough confidence to step forward. The room was large and bright, with a big, comfortable bed, a built-in closet, and a small desk. The walls were decorated with posters and drawings, and a window offered a view of the peaceful garden outside. This is your room, Andres," Sophia said, smiling proudly. "I hope you like it." Andres looked around the room, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. It was incredible to think that this place, so warm and cozy, belonged to him. After so many years of living outdoors or in temporary shelters, having his own space, a place where he could feel safe and protected, it was something he'd never imagined. Slowly, he walked over to the bed and ran his fingers over the soft, cozy duvet, marveling at the sensation. Everything in this room seemed to be waiting for him, as if it had been prepared especially for him. His father came over and placed a hand on his shoulder, looking at him with a warm smile. "Do you like it, son?" he asked softly. Andres looked at him, feeling suddenly unsure. I don't know what to say," he murmured, looking down. I've never had anything like this before." Sophia came closer and knelt down in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "Well, this is your home now, Andres," she said tenderly. "This room, this house, we're your family, and we're going to be together forever." Andres looked at her, tears welling up in his eyes again. It was too much to process, too good to be true. For so long, he'd lived in absolute solitude, struggling to survive each day, that the idea of having a family, a home, seemed like an impossible dream. But here he was, surrounded by these two people who were looking at him with such love and devotion, who were claiming him as their own. And despite the confusion and uncertainty, a part of him felt happy, blessed to have been found, to finally belong to someone. Slowly, Andres moved closer to Sophia and hugged her tightly, burying his face in her neck. Sophia held him close, gently stroking his back and whispering words of comfort. "Shh, it's all right, my love," she said, her voice soft. "You're safe now, with us. Nothing bad is going to happen to you again." Andres clung to her, feeling all the barriers he'd built up over the years slowly crumbling. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, to let the pain and loneliness he had carried for so long flow freely. His father came over and placed a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. Andres looked up and saw reflected in the man's eyes the same compassion, the same love he'd seen in his mother's. He gradually calmed down, feeling comforted by the warmth and security that surrounded him. When he finally pulled away, Sophia smiled at him tenderly, gently wiping the tears from his face. "Welcome home, my love," she said, kissing his forehead softly. "You're safe here, with us. Nothing will ever separate us again." Andres nodded, a shy smile touching his lips. Despite the confusion and uncertainty that still gripped him, a feeling of warmth and belonging began to fill his heart. Maybe, after all, this could be the home he'd been searching for all his life. The following days were a roller coaster of emotions for Andres. After the emotional reunion with his parents at the mall, the little boy found himself immersed in a completely new and overwhelming world. Sophia and her husband, whom Andres soon learned to call Dad, did everything they could to make him feel welcome and safe in their home. They showed him every corner of the house, introduced him to their closest family and friends, and assured him time and time again that this was his real home, the place where he belonged. However, Andres still felt overwhelmed and confused by everything that was happening. After spending so many years alone, struggling to survive on the streets, adapting to this new reality filled with affection and security was a constant challenge. There were times when he felt overwhelmed by the intensity of the feelings that washed over him. The affection and devotion that Sophia and his father showed him at every moment were so foreign to anything he'd ever known that sometimes he found it hard to believe they were real. At other times, insecurity and fear would creep in, making him wonder if all this wasn't just a dream from which he would eventually have to wake up. And if he wasn't really their son, if everything turned out to be a terrible mistake, the thought of losing all this, of love, the idea of going back to solitude and uncertainty terrified him. But Sophia and her father were patient and understanding, knowing that the adaptation process would be slow and challenging. Every time Andres became withdrawn or distant, they welcomed him with hugs and words of comfort, assuring him time and time again that they would be there for him, no matter what happened. Little by little, Andres began to relax and allow that affection to enter his heart. He still found it hard to believe that all this was real, that he really had a family that loved him and claimed him as their own. But every time Sophia hugged him or his father ruffled his hair affectionately, he felt an unfamiliar warmth filling his chest. One morning, a week after his return, Andres woke up feeling more rested and serene than he could remember. During the night, he had had a peaceful sleep, without the usual nightmare that used to torment him. He sat up slowly, carefully observing the room Sophia and his father had prepared for him. The walls were decorated with some of his drawings, and on the nightstand, there was a framed photo of the three of them together, smiling at the camera. A small smile touched his lips as he contemplated that image. Seeing the three of them together, as a family, was something that still seemed almost unreal to him. Slowly, he stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the peaceful garden. The morning sun bathed everything in its warm light, and birdsong filled the air with a soothing melody. It was so different from the sunrises he used to witness on the streets, where cold and uncertainty were his usual companions. Here, in this house, everything seemed more serene, safer. Andres ran his fingers over the silver pendant hanging from his neck, that small necklace that had been the key that led him back to his family. He still found it hard to believe that after all these years, it was this simple ornament that had allowed them to find him. At that moment, he heard footsteps in the hallway, and the door to his room opened softly. Sophia poked her head in, giving him a warm smile when she saw he was awake. "Good morning, my love," she said, entering and approaching him. "Did you sleep well?" Andres nodded, feeling the tension that usually accompanied him in the mornings slowly dissipate. "Yes, I slept very well," he replied, managing a small smile. Sophia smiled back and pulled him close, giving him a soft kiss on the forehead. "I'm so glad, sweetheart," she said, tenderly caressing his cheek. "Do you want to come down for breakfast? Your father made your favorite." Andres felt his heart fill with warmth at those words. He was still getting used to the idea of having a father who cared about his likes and dislikes. "Yes, I'd like that very much," he replied, nodding gently. Sophia smiled and took his hand, leading him gently towards the door. Together they walked down the stairs to the kitchen, where his father was waiting for them with a big smile. "Good morning, champ," he greeted, coming over to ruffle his hair affectionately. "How are you this morning?" Andres felt a bit self-conscious at his father's open display of affection, but he managed a shy smile. "Good, thank you," he replied, letting his father lead him to the table. Laid out on the wooden surface was an abundant breakfast: toast, scrambled eggs, orange juice, and a stack of freshly made pancakes. Andres stared at it all, his eyes shining, feeling his stomach rumble with hunger. "I hope you have an appetite, son," his father said, serving generous portions onto a plate. "You need to replenish all that energy." Andres nodded and began to eat, savoring the delicious taste of every bite. It had been so long since he'd tasted food as delicious and homemade as this. On the streets, he'd always had to make do with leftovers or canned food. As he ate, Sophia and his father watched him with radiant expressions, as if seeing him enjoy the food were the greatest joy. "Do you like it, sweetheart?" Sophia asked, gently stroking his hand. Andres looked up and gave them a small smile. It's delicious," he replied, suddenly feeling a little shy at the attention they were giving him. Thank you very much." His father smiled at him proudly and poured him some more juice. "I'm glad you like it, son," he said, patting his back gently. "You can eat all you want. You'll never go without here." Andres nodded, feeling a little overwhelmed by the warmth and abundance that surrounded him. After so long living with uncertainty and scarcity, this feeling of security and comfort was almost overwhelming. But little by little, he relaxed and fully enjoyed the delicious breakfast. Sophia and his father chatted animatedly around him, but made sure to include him in the conversation, asking him questions and encouraging him to participate. Andres surprised himself by answering more and more readily, feeling more and more comfortable in the company of these two people who, despite being strangers to him just a week ago, had now become his family. When they finished breakfast, his father stood up and came over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "So, Andres," he said with a smile, "how about after breakfast I show you a bit more of the house and garden?" Andre looked at him with expectant eyes, nodding enthusiastically. The idea of exploring this new home in more depth excited him. I'd love to," he replied, feeling the excitement reflected in his voice. His father gave him a beaming smile and gestured for him to follow. Andres got up from the table, casting one last glance at Sophia, who winked at him conspiratorially. Together, father and son left the kitchen and began to tour the house, his father proudly pointing out every corner and explaining in detail the history behind each piece of furniture and ornament. Andres listened attentively, his mind absorbing each word as if they were a treasure. He had never had the opportunity to live in a real house before, to have a home to belong to, and now suddenly he found himself immersed in this warm and welcoming world, surrounded by people who seemed to love him unconditionally. As they walked through the house, his father told him some family stories about his grandparents and the special moments they had lived in this very house. Andres listened with fascination, feeling increasingly connected to this place and the people who lived in it. They finally reached the backyard, a spacious green area with a small vegetable garden and a play area. Andres looked around with wide eyes, feeling a sense of peace and belonging wash over him. This is your home now, Andres," his father said with a warm smile. "A safe place where you'll always have a refuge and a family that loves you." Andres looked at him, feeling tears welling up in his eyes. It was overwhelming to have all this after living so many years in loneliness and uncertainty. This feeling of security and comfort was almost too much. Slowly, he walked over to his father and hugged him tightly, letting his emotions flow freely. His father held him tenderly, gently stroking his hair. "It's okay, son," he whispered. "You're safe now. Nothing bad is going to happen to you again." Andres clung to him, feeling as if a weight he hadn't even known he was carrying was slowly lifting. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly safe and loved. And the idea of belonging to this place, to this family, filled him with an indescribable joy. When they finally pulled away, his father looked at him with a radiant smile, gently wiping the tears from his cheeks. "Welcome home, Andres," he said warmly. "This is your home now, and we'll be your family forever." Andres nodded, feeling overwhelmed with emotion. He knew the road ahead would be complicated, full of uncertainties and challenges. But now, with his parents by his side, he felt he could overcome any obstacle. Finally, after so many years of loneliness and struggle for survival, he had found the place where he belonged, and nothing and no one was going to take it away from him again. The following weeks were a constant process of adaptation for Andres. After so many years of living alone on the streets, learning to share his life with a family and to fully trust them was a daily challenge. Sofia and his father, whose name Andres soon discovered was Ignacio, did their best to make him feel welcome and safe in his new home. They showed patience and understanding at each of his small steps forward, celebrating each achievement as if it were the greatest of successes. Little by little, Andres began to relax and allow that warmth and affection to enter his heart. He no longer feared as much that everything would vanish like a dream, and he was starting to allow himself to believe that he truly had a place to belong. One of the biggest challenges was learning to accept his parents' displays of affection. He'd spent so long alone, without receiving the slightest gesture of affection, that every hug, every caress, every word of encouragement surprised and overwhelmed him. But little by little, Andres grew accustomed to those demonstrations of love. He began to seek out those moments of closeness himself, snuggling up to Sofia on the couch or letting Ignacio hug him tightly. And as he felt safer and more confident, Andres began to share more of himself with his parents. He talked to them about his fears and his dreams, told them about the hardships he'd experienced on the streets, and showed them some of the drawings he'd done over the years. Sofia and Ignacio listened with attention and empathy, offering their unconditional support and assuring him again and again that he would never have to face those situations again. "You have a family now, Andres," Sofia would tell him, hugging him tenderly. "You'll never have to go through that again. We're here for you, and we'll always take care of you." Those words, filled with love and commitment, filled Andres' heart with a warmth he had never experienced before. For so long, he'd yearned for a home, for a family to protect him, and now suddenly he was surrounded by the affection and security he'd longed for so much. One of the most significant moments for Andres was when Sofia and Ignacio suggested that he call them Mom and Dad. At first, he felt a little unsure, as he still found it hard to believe they were really his true parents. But when he saw the emotion and hope reflected in their faces, he couldn't help but agree. Slowly, the words Mom and Dad began to come naturally to his lips, and each time he uttered them, he felt a warmth flooding his chest. They were words that represented a bond, a connection that had been lost for so many years and had now been restored. Calling Sofia and Ignacio that way gave him a sense of belonging and security that he'd never experienced before. Little by little, Andres began to feel more comfortable and settled into this new life. Exploring the house and garden became one of his favorite activities, discovering every corner and detail with a mixture of wonder and curiosity. Sometimes he'd catch himself laughing and playing with Ignacio as if he'd done it all his life. Or he'd spend hours curled up next to Sofia, listening, fascinated, to the stories she told him about his childhood and that of his grandparents. He even began to interact with some of the neighbors and family friends, slowly overcoming his natural distrust of strangers. Sofia and Ignacio made sure to introduce him and make him feel welcome, assuring him that, little by little, he would make new friends. One of the things that surprised Andres the most was how much he enjoyed going to school. After so many years of living on the streets, the idea of having a routine and a place to go to every day seemed like a dream come true. Sofia and Ignacio had enrolled him in a nearby school, talking to the teachers to make sure Andres felt comfortable and supported. And to everyone's surprise, the boy adapted quite easily, showing a great interest in learning and excelling in several subjects. The teachers praised him for his intelligence and dedication, and Sofia and Ignacio were bursting with pride whenever they received a positive report about their son. Seeing Andres so enthusiastic about school and the possibility of building a future filled their hearts with satisfaction. But despite all this progress, Andres still had moments when insecurity and fear would creep in. He had been through so much in his short life that sometimes he found it hard to believe he was really safe, and that this new life wasn't going to vanish like a dream. On those occasions, Sofia and Ignacio would offer him all the support and reassurance he needed. They'd hug him tightly, whisper words of comfort, and assure him, over and over, that he would never have to be alone again. Little by little, Andres learned to trust them, to let that love and security envelop him completely. There were still times when he felt overwhelmed, but those episodes became less and less frequent as the days went by. One night, while they were having dinner together, Andres dared to ask a question that had been on his mind ever since he'd been reunited with them. "Mom, Dad," he said quietly, how did you find me? How did you know it was me?" Sofia and Ignacio exchanged a look full of emotion. Then they turned to him with a smile. "It was the necklace, Andres," Sofia replied, reaching out across the table to take his hand. "That little silver pendant you were wearing. I put it on you myself when you were a baby, and I never forgot it." Andres looked down at the necklace hanging around his neck, gently stroking the pendant. So this necklace was mine?" he asked, his eyes shining. Ignacio nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's right, son," he said softly. "That necklace, it was a gift we gave you when you were baptized. You've always been our Andres, and that necklace is what finally allowed us to find you." Andres felt tears welling up in his eyes, emotion flooding his heart. For so long, that simple necklace had been his only link to his past, and now it turned out to be irrefutable proof that they were really his family. "So, what happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. How was I kidnapped as a baby?" Sofia and Ignacio exchanged a somber look, and Andres could see the sadness and pain reflected in their faces. "It was a terrible night, Andres," Sofia whispered, squeezing his hand tightly. "We were home. You were sleeping peacefully in your crib, and suddenly some men broke into the house and snatched you from our arms." Andres stared at her, horrified, unable to believe what he was hearing. "It was some men?" he asked, his voice trembling. They stole me from you?" Ignacio nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, son," he replied, his voice grave. "It was a kidnapping. Those men forced their way in and ripped you from our lives. Your mother and I, we did everything we could to find you, but you disappeared without a trace." Andres felt the world around him fading as his father's words echoed in his mind. He couldn't believe that someone could have done such a thing to a helpless baby, to rip him from the arms of his parents. But why?" he murmured, his voice breaking. Why did they do that to me?" Sofia pulled him close, enveloping him in a protective embrace. "We don't know, my love," she whispered, stroking his hair. "We could never figure out the reasons those wretches had. The only thing that matters is that we finally found you, and you'll never be alone again." Andres clung to her, feeling tears sliding down his cheeks. His whole life had been plagued by loneliness and uncertainty, and now he learned that it had all been the result of such a heinous, cruel act. Ignacio came closer and hugged him too, holding him tenderly. "It's okay, son," he said softly. "It's over now. You're safe, with your mother and me. We'll never let anything happen to you again." Andres clung to them, feeling the pain and anguish he'd accumulated over so many years flowing freely. He'd been through so much, he'd suffered so much, and now finally he had his parents by his side, willing to protect him and love him unconditionally. When he finally managed to calm down, Andres looked at them with shining eyes filled with deep gratitude. Thank you, he whispered, his voice trembling. Thank you for not giving up, for, for looking for me all this time. Sophia smiled at him tenderly, caressing his cheek. We never gave up, my love, she said with conviction. You are our son, and we've loved you from the very first moment we held you in our arms. We were never going to stop looking for you. Andres nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and gratitude flooding his heart. After so many years of loneliness and struggle for survival, he had finally found the home and family he had longed for. From that moment on, Andres opened up more and more to his parents, sharing with them all his fears, his dreams, and his hopes. He knew he still had a long way to go to heal the wounds of the past, but with Sofia and Ignacio by his side, he felt he could face any challenge. Together, they began to explore ways to help him process everything he'd been through, from therapy to activities that would allow him to express his emotions safely. Andres was reluctant at first, but he gradually came to understand that these tools were essential for his well-being. One of the biggest challenges was when Sofia and Ignacio suggested the idea of seeking legal help to try to regain custody of Andres. After so many years, the case of his kidnapping was still open, but the authorities had not been able to find those responsible, or Andres. Andres was terrified at first, afraid that all this was just a mirage and that he could lose it.